Stardust posted a video titled The Libertarian Right Dilemma, Women's Suffrage and Freedom. And I want to reiterate a lot of the points that he brought up in this video. Now, I'll tell you a quick story about a girl I was messing around with in the beginning of 2013. And we were at a restaurant, and I forget how the topic came up, and frankly, it's relevant at this point. But the topic of politics came up. And, I remember saying something about how the welfare state and entitlement programs are playing a large part in bankrupting this country and how they just can't be sustained. And it was the first time, really, that I ever broached the topic of politics in any depth with her before. And I'll never forget it. I'll never forget what happened after that and her reaction specifically. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Half-Baked, which is the cult classic with Dave Chappelle, and the specific scene that I'm talking about is going to be in the description box. But the scene that I'm referring to is when Dave Chappelle's character first meets his romantic interest, Mary Jane. And they went out for an ice cream sundae, right? It was like a date or something along those lines. And the ironically named but pretty attractive Mary Jane, who was staunchly against drugs, told Dave Chappelle's character that her dad was in jail for selling drugs, specifically marijuana, and then she recited the generic cliches about, marijuana being a gateway drug and all of that, and she said something to the effect of marijuana leading to more hardcore vices, and Dave Chappelle jokingly said, well, yeah, mostly junk food. To which she replied with an awkward laugh, and then she said, well, wait, now you don't smoke marijuana, do you? And Dave Chappelle, of course, lies about it, knowing that whether or not he'd get to bang Mary Jane was pretty much hinging on how he answered that question. And so, of course, he denied smoking weed. And then the entire movie basically revolves around Chappelle trying to hide the fact that he's a habitual pot smoker from Mary Jane. So again, back to the girl I was having dinner with. Something very similar happened to me. And what happened to me with this chick is that we were talking about politics, and so when I brought up these things about the welfare state, she looked at me with suspicion in her eyes, right? And she says, well, wait, you're not a Republican, are you? Right? With that same, well, I really want to keep fucking this guy, but, Republicans are evil, they hate women look, right? So she was giving me that look. And so at this point, I'd been MGTOW for many years, and I find that a policy of complete honesty is best when dealing with women that I'm romantically involved with. So I told her exactly how I felt about the situation. I said, no, I'm not a Republican, and I'm not a Democrat either. I don't play that ism-schism game, right? I take each issue on its own merit, and then I make up my own mind. But that I did feel that conservatives on this issue had a point that, we just can't keep spending like this, and that it's unsustainable, and that we just can no longer afford it. And I also explained to her many of the things I disagree with about Republicans as well. And frankly, I just put it all out there. And if that disqualified me from continuing to bang her, well, it was what it was. But it didn't. And, she never brought up politics again, and neither did I. But this illustrates exactly what Stardust was talking about, that women equate things like conservative values in politics as being innately anti-women, even if they know very little about conservative politics overall. Women feel that conservatives are anti-women, and women just don't need to know much more information than that. And frankly, from the perspective of a woman, conservatives are in fact anti-women. And the reason I say that is because they seek to divest the various privileges women have accrued in Western civilization from women. And that's all that women need to know to come to the conclusion that conservatives, to them, are anti-women. So, now, are there women conservatives? Well, of course there are women conservatives. And are there women libertarians? Of course they are. But you know what? I can't help but think that a lot of these so-called female conservatives and female libertarians would magically become very liberal very fast if they didn't have a husband busting his ass day in and day out to maintain her lifestyle. And indeed, many a conservative woman has used the powers granted to her by default that every woman wields in the divorce courts once she wanted a divorce from her husband. And, all of these skinny little groupie libertarian women on YouTube and elsewhere, I'm talking about, would most likely be begging for government intervention in the event that their town or their city or whatever is devastated by a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or something along those lines. How many of these women would be sucking FEMA dick for rations and food and shelter in a heartbeat under those circumstances? And the whole point I'm trying to make is that women even women that claim to be on the side of men, and they very well may be on the side of men, but each and every one of those women benefit from an array of privileges in our society that make me uneasy about them, to say the least. And this, I think, is the major flaw in the, just shrink the government and misandry and gynocentrism will somehow autocorrect crowd. That is that women seem to have a natural and ingrained aversion to a small state and to using as little government services as possible, and even the ones that talk a good game and appear to not be like that are most likely fair weather libertarians or MRAs or conservatives, etc. And then you have the added problem of a great many men in conservative circles being infectiously gynocentric and more than willing to throw men under the bus in all sorts of ways if it falls in line with their traditionalist conservative ideology. And we see that till this day, right? Not a single one of these people, these types that see leftism and communism everywhere and disagree with me that feminism was an organic process that sprung from fertile gynocentric soil that was already in place. Not a single one of these individuals have answered the question as to why people like Phyllis Schlafly mobilized conservative forces to strike down the Equal Rights Amendment, and not a single one of these people have done so, because to do so would mean to acknowledge the blatant hypocrisy that conservatives show towards selective service, and to do so would tarnish this meme they perpetuate that says conservatives are at worst neutral towards the issues that men face and at best sympathetic. But more on this later, or perhaps another video, because right now I want to discuss a pretty fascinating thread on Reddit having to do with the demographics of the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. So every year, the anarcho-capitalist Reddit conducts a survey to gather information on its subscribers, and some of the questions are things like, what are your religious beliefs? Do you support Bitcoin? What are your opinions on intellectual property and copyright law? What is your moral theory? Do you believe in free will, etc.? And then they ask, what is your gender? And it turns out, surprise, surprise, that 96% of the members of this ANCAP Reddit community are male. Now, granted, this is a small sample size of only a few hundred people, but my suspicion is that absolutely you will see, if an anarcho-capitalist community ever gets off the ground, you will see at any time upwards of 95% of those involved in building and funding it being men. Because women, it seems, do not like to build civilizations. They like to depend on civilizations and the men that build them, and only ever take up residence in those civilizations after the hard work of establishing it is done. And they do this as well with numerous subcultures within these civilizations generated mostly by men. Look at Comic-Con, look at the sports industry and the football industry, and having the football players wear pink, and the hijacking of the atheism community with Atheism Plus, right? Women don't want to put in the work that men do, but they want to benefit from the work that men do. And the interesting thing is that even these anarcho-capitalist types seem to know this, and the post that I'm about to reference here details exactly that. Now, this was a post about Seasteading, which is a fascinating little group of anarcho-capitalists, and a subscriber put me onto these people. Right? It's a group of anarcho-capitalists that have embarked upon the brave journey, set upon the brave task of establishing a bona fide, largely self-sufficient seafaring micronation that would roam the seas with essentially no real government and an unflinching adherence to the free market and meritocracy. And this is what I love about men. This is ambitious, it's grand, and I don't know, maybe even a bit naive and utopian, but these men, they dare to dream, right? And they inspire visions, at least in me, of a real life Bioshock's Rapture, or Columbia's Floating City, or Elysium, or something like that. And I love that stuff, and I wish them all the luck in the world. If I were a betting man, I'd probably bet against them, but again, they dare to dream, they dare to envision a grand future for humanity, and I respect that, and we need more of that. But again, the post that I wanted to mention is titled, "Here's how anarcho-capitalists will attract more women into the movement, tons of them guaranteed," and the post read, quote, "First, I will assume that we build a seastead sometime during the next decade, based on some scalable product like perhaps algae-based biodiesel production. I'll assume, secondly, that such a seastead will be quite financially remunerative. One estimate says a free society should be 4 to 8 times wealthier compared to current society. Women, like men, know a good financial opportunity when they see it, and generally will be attracted to higher wage regions, especially that much higher. They will begin using the volunteer services we will build because those will have a large amount of buy-in by the rest of us. The network effect will promote their use amongst new entrants to voluntarist society thereby. And finally, women will osmote voluntarist values by living them in a free society, by seeing them working and then buying into them in their own lives and becoming comfortable using them. We, that is men, are key in this equation because we must first bring into existence these voluntary services and institutions that do not currently exist. In the same way that a bank requires knowledgeable people in finance to build the bank, yet anyone off the street can use a bank account, we will need to know voluntarist philosophy as it applies to various sectors to build the voluntarist services that a truly free society must have and use. You guys know these services already: voluntarist money, voluntarist law, voluntarist courts, DROs, and voluntarist police/securities. And by this means, large swaths of humanity looking for merely more remunerative employment can come to absorb voluntarist values by living them out in their own lives. So basically, again, I find this fascinating. The author of this post basically says, well, we're going to have to bribe women into joining us in Ancapistan with money and wealth, and that they can pretty much expect a sausage fest until they start generating the wealth themselves. And isn't it amazing that the more things change, the more they actually do stay the same? And I think this dovetails with my assertion that civilization and technological advancement, and most importantly, the way civilizations change over time, are merely a function of a fixed human nature that is adapting to changes in technology along the way. And I think this lends support to my belief that, again, the changes we saw with feminism and the sexual revolution were not caused by some hidden hand or communist or whatever, but by the Industrial Revolution, by estrogen and progestin in a capsule, by the development of modern abortifacients. And, these hidden handers amongst us, they do a disservice, I think, to the efforts of men to understand what it means to be men and indeed what it means to be human. And they do a disservice to the expansion of male consciousness and to the quest for male sovereignty when they pollute our quest for understanding by saying that, the communists or whatever did this to women, that feminism did this to women, that feminists corrupted women, when in reality, feminism didn't change women at all, not one bit. Feminism only occurred because women and men stayed exactly the same. And unless we understand that, we'll be stuck fighting symptoms, not causes, but symptoms of the havoc that gynocentrism run amok can leave in its wake, especially for men. And in explaining this, perhaps then you'll see why people like myself, people like Stardusk, people like Razorblade Candy have so vehemently resisted TradCon ideas and TradCon solutions, injecting themselves into MGTOW in this movement. Frankly, I could care less what individual people do, and if they want to have a relationship involving traditional gender roles, that's really none of my business, right? I don't care about that. And it's often been said by the most vociferous of TradCon proponents, the village idiot, you guys know who I'm talking about, right? That MGTOW apparently hate married men and that we're jealous of married men and their families. And, this is so categorically false that really I don't even know where to begin in refuting it, but I'll start by mentioning that one of my favorite manosphere content producers was, and still is, Man Woman Myth. And this is a man who I have an immense amount of respect for, and I've talked to personally on occasion, but Man Woman Myth is married, right? And he's personally admitted this, and more importantly, he's also personally admitted to me, and in comment sections, that he couldn't in good conscience instruct or advise his own son to ever get married. And I think that makes all the difference. Here's a man who decided in his own personal life and for his own personal reasons that marriage was right for him, but understands what the potential risks are and cares enough about other men and his own son that he made some of the best content in the manosphere of all time, warning other men to avoid marriage. And he cares enough about his son to extend that warning to him as well. And now if we contrast this with the village idiot and his cohorts, this is a man who will gladly instead occlude the dangers of marriage to push his family values horseshit agenda. And he'll tell men that all they have to do is, do something like pick the right woman or whatever, knowing that for many men, this course of action will end in disaster or financial ruin or even suicide. But he doesn't care, because he's so invested in his personal delusion of the marriage contract that he'll actively lead men to their own ruin so that he can save face. And that's why he's so disgusting. And frankly, we do the same thing as a whole, or rather traditionalists do the same thing as a whole when they dogmatically proffer the left, the evil incarnate demon hordes of the left, and feminism and the usual spiel as being the sole reason for the, according to them, corruption of millions upon millions of supposedly virtuous, innocent women that waltz day in and day out, every day, into our divorce courts and ruin men's lives with a pen stroke on a daily basis by initiating and signing their divorce settlements. You see, it's the sheltered and naive view of the problems men are currently dealing with that include the depth and scope of our current situation as men. And the reason I so vehemently resist it is because believing that defeating feminism, which is again a symptom of the disease and not the cause of it, will leave us much more unprepared for when another wave of male disposability and gynocentrism barrel into men at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And that's when, not if, but when. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me read to you a comment from J. on one of my videos that I posted that was essentially just a clip from the anime Monster. I believe I posted it on my other channel, right? And the clip is titled The Nameless Monster, and it's really interesting, full of metaphor, and really interesting to watch. And that's in the description box, and in order to kind of understand the beginning of this comment, you'll have to watch that for yourself. It's only a few minutes. But I think J.'s comment here crystallizes perfectly what I refer to as the next great male obsolescence. And he says, quote, "Barbarossa, yes, the symbolism is quite powerful, but I'm afraid truth sometimes is even worse than the most horrible tales. What if the monster doesn't need to kill and eat anyone else? What if the monster does not need other victims any longer, like the praying mantis or the black widow? You see, this new monster doesn't need to feed on its victim, because the ultimate goal has been achieved. One day, into the future, we humans will have real androids, that is, male droids. And in this context, he's not talking about, the way we talk about sex dolls sometimes. He's talking about robots that can supplant male labor. And he says it's not a question of if, it's more a question of when. You only need to take a look at the Honda Asimo and see its evolution in the past 30 years. Imagine what androids will look like in the year 2040. These androids will free humanity from hard labor and danger and risks and hazardous tasks, but there will be no need for human workers, at least in dangerous positions. Human strength won't be needed. Men's strength won't be needed. Hundreds of millions of men will be out of a job. Construction workers and coal miners, they won't be needed. Men will be considered dangerous because being unemployed, they will face poverty and hunger and discrimination. And with artificial insemination in androids, nameless monsters won't need their victims' names or surnames, but they won't need their victims at all. One day, men will have to face reality. Women won't need men. The state won't need men. Societies won't need men. Evolution naturally deselects the unneeded for extinction. Think about that and let me know." End quote. This is an excellent observation, I think. We now live in an age where a robot serves 360 hamburgers an hour, more efficiently than any human could. I work in manufacturing, right? And they have welding machines where I work that TIG weld faster and straighter and cleaner than any welder I've ever seen. And the vast majority of Manhattan taxi cab drivers are male. And just so happens that Google has just created the very first automated vehicle that drives better and smoother and in a shorter distance than any human being. So here's an interesting headline. Protesters, and the article of this is in the description box. Protesters show up at the doorstep of Google self-driving car engineer. And the article details what is a bunch of what seems to be like, Berkeley, California trendies, accusing the Google engineer of wanting to create a, quote, cyber-capitalist utopia while millions of people are still slaving away in the Congo and China or whatever. But this article, right, is kind of symbolic, and it made me wonder whether or not this protest is a harbinger of things to come, of something much bigger, right? When machines completely supplant workers, and when men and male labor is needed less and less. And if you really assess it, the manner in which the rules of the free market apply will not change, because just like feminism, the forces that drive the free market economy are human forces revolving around human nature. But robotization, that is the next phase of the mechanization effect, as Stardust likes to refer to it, will most certainly change how capitalism expresses itself, with probably a move towards the more talented and well-trained worker. And we're approaching the next great male mass obsolescence. Because if you try to make some sense out of this, we can clearly see that, at least right now, capitalist economies are built currently around providing as many jobs to as many people as possible. And these jobs are built around the manufacturing of goods. And that is the manufacturing of enough goods and creating enough jobs that supplement infrastructure and trading, in necessary goods, in agriculture and other necessary commodities. And the eventual goal is then to create enough of these indispensable jobs that a working and functioning society is created, or at least the template for it. And this template represents a working, functioning society in which non-essential commerce can then hinge itself on, right? We need enough engineers and scientists that create bridges and new technologies and infrastructure to provide the preliminary foundation for what comes later. And these are our hair salons and our movie theaters and our iPads and our cell phones. And we can then go about creating stock exchanges. But what happens when technology progresses enough that one engineer can direct a legion of robots from a computer desk to build a bridge or to assemble an apartment complex brick by brick? What effect is this going to have on our never-ending quest to employ as many human beings as possible? Well, we're not going to need construction workers any longer, and we're not going to need welders any longer, and since we've now designed robots that can lift heavier and weld straighter than any human being can, right? And so construction workers will be put out of work, and then their union reps will be unemployed, and workers' compensation assessors will be unemployed, right? And all that's going to remain is the one engineer or the team of engineers directing these robots and a much smaller skeleton crew of highly skilled maintenance staff charged with servicing these robots. So we have to ask ourselves, if we continue with this attitude of jobs, 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 and if companies are always trying to cut costs and produce a higher quality product at a cheaper price, these companies will undoubtedly be looking to make the manufacturing of their product as efficient as possible. Meaning if they can get a machine to do a man's job, they will. And technology is going to create an economy where the goal of a healthy economy won't be to create more jobs, but to create less non-essential jobs and more jobs that are indispensable. The goal will be for an economy that can do without the expensive human worker and his sick days and his lunch breaks and his unionizing and his tendency towards human error and his fatigue, right? And his need for weekends. So you see, if it is our very capitalistic natures that may very well one day put a massive portion of our population out of work, a massive portion of men out of work. And at that point, feminism might not even exist anymore. And yet even still, at that point, you're going to see just how women that will know of feminism only in their history books, you'll see just how deep and dark women's hatred and the state's hatred for unnecessary men really runs. And even then, we're going to blame the state, right? We're going to blame whatever power elite exists at the time, but we won't blame women. We won't blame them, will we? That's all I got to say for now. Thanks for listening.